Hi, I'm Michael Freeman. In photography, we're always talking about light as the basic commodity we deal with. How to measure it, get the right exposure for it, the quality of light from golden hour to a harsh midday sun, and how to make the best use of it. Indeed, one of my most recent books is this, Light and How to Photograph It. As we all know, there are times, many times, when the quality of light and how it falls can make or break a shot. But there's an equal yet opposite partner in this, and that's shadow. So what, you might think? That's pretty obvious. We all know what shadows are. Well, I thought I knew everything there is to know about shadows after shooting professionally for decades, until I started looking at them seriously and in detail for a project I've been working on for the last few months. In a normal scene, and when it's normally photographed, there are of course shadows, midtones and highlights. To be a little more discriminating, let's say shadows, midtones, brights and highlights. The case I'm going to make is that shadows deserve more attention than any of the others and are potentially more interesting, while at the same time typical modern processing, both in camera and out, is opening them up unnecessarily. Of all these groups of tones, shadows offer the widest range of interpretation and stand apart from everything else in our visual experience. It's not just that shadows and highlights occupy the two ends and set the limits for sight, they're fundamentally different in human experience. It shouldn't be any surprise that both figure largely in art, religion, psychology and literature in separate ways. And I'd argue that shadows offer the most fascination. I don't think it's too fanciful to say that shadows represent what we don't know, what's concealed from us, and therefore make us more curious. Brights and highlights reveal, shadows conceal and withhold. A favourite of mine is this short book by a Japanese writer in the 1930s, Junichiro Tanizaki, called In Praise of Shadows, which says it well. Why so important? Well, the point is that midtones by definition take care of themselves. So a typical ordinary subject and a typical ordinary scene average out at around 50% brightness. Average is average. The whole premise of camera metering is to deliver a mid-tone. Brights are similarly uncomplicated. Everything's visible and one or two stops brighter than average. Highlights are delicate and need to be protected so that they don't snap to featureless white, but most cameras functioning automatically tend to take care of that pretty well these days. So it's in the shadows that things get interesting. Certainly, there are many picture situations where shadows don't really make an impact. They're just a normal part of the way the light falls, and they're not actually doing very much for the image. And if you're the kind of photographer who likes light and bright imagery most of the time, they're going to be low on your list of priorities. Well, I like light and bright some of the time, but to be honest, most of the time I find the depth and richness of shadows more interesting. In imaging, one of the key concepts is called salience. It means basically what the eye is drawn to most in a picture, what's important to the viewer. And nearly all the time, what people are talking about is a subject, like a person or a face. Typically a clear object, and it can even be small but still draw the eye. However, many photographers are attracted to shooting a scene less because the subject itself is interesting, but because they like some other image quality, like the play of light, or the colours, or the shadows. Shadows by no means have to be the subject to be salient. They simply need to play a key role in making the picture successful. Often, the part they need to play is to surround the obvious subject, to provide a tonal counterpoint or setting, and not to take the viewer's attention away unnecessarily from the subject. Here's what I mean. This image is from Peru, shot on black and white negative film. The obvious subject is the harp and player, But the full subject is the atmosphere of a simple highland bar in the Andes. And that accounts for the wide-angle lens to take in much of the room and for the camera angle toward the light source, which is an open doorway, for maximum texture and contrast. Particularly important are the textural light on the harp and on the flagstones, and the silhouette of the player's head and shoulders against the reflected daylight on the wall. The deep shadows, from the far wall by way of the men to the area under the foreground table, serve to keep attention on the harp, player and flagstones, and to give the complete image a strong structure. Actually, there's a long tradition in art of this. Painters like Caravaggio and Rembrandt. So, if the shadows are going to take center stage in a picture, then it's going to be important to give some thought to how strong they are, how deep, how dark, because they can go all the way from this to this. You may have heard of the zone system, which was invented by Ansel Adams and Fred Archer in 1940, and it's acquired something of a daunting reputation for photographers. But in fact, it's one of the clearest methods of deciding what level of brightness goes where in a photograph. And that's pretty fundamental. They invented it as a way of perfecting how the final black and white print would look. And the great and simple idea behind it is that you start thinking about how the photograph will look as you start to take the picture. And that's still completely relevant, maybe even more so today. Instead of taking the shot and then figuring out what the shadows and midtones and highlights should look like when you get onto the computer, you decide right at the beginning. Frankly, that's the best kind of workflow there is. Know what you want and why you want it from the start. Anyway, the zone system simply divides up the possible tones in a picture from 0 to 10. 0 is pure black, 10 pure white. That makes 11 zones, and each one has a purpose, a characteristic. So, zone 5 is the midtone, and the zones below are some degree of shadow, while above you have brights from zone 6 to 8, and then above that, highlights. In the zone system, there are 5 depths of shadow, starting with 0, which is pure empty black, solid. Here are black shadows, completely featureless, and that's exactly what's needed here as a plain studio background. In wet darkroom printing, you get finely attuned to the subtleties of shadows. Each shadow zone actually means something. And it's interesting to see how those West Coast photographers like Adams and Weston wrote about them. Shadow Zone 1, for example, they said, nearly black, the beginnings of sense of empty space. Here's an example. Going up one step to Zone 2, the first sense of an emergence of texture on the borderline between visible and invisible, mysterious. Now, that's kind of an interesting approach to shadows, that it has some sense and meaning beyond just being very dark. Deep shadows like these have just a hint of detail, a suggestion of what might be there, but nothing clear. They have depth, three-dimensionality, the suggestion of space receding, going on, hidden things, mysterious, low-key, noir. In this picture, taken in remote rainforest in Suriname, the dark tree trunks of the backdrop recede, hinting at an endless mass of forest behind the girl. Had these shadows been more open, the mystery, even ominousness, would be lost. But also note that the highlight is critical. The lit edge of the girl, and in particular the glint on the fishing line, define the subject. Some photographs can be both shadow salient and highlight salient, and this is one. The obvious subject is a girl fishing, unusually and unattractively lit. The broader subject is a girl fishing on the edge of the Amazon rainforest. In this next picture, taken in Myanmar at dusk, 85% of the image is shadow, and most of it deep. Nevertheless, there's enough information to make the scene understandable. From the straightforward pagoda shapes, one of them bright and very clear, and the mid-toned river with sandbanks at the top of the frame. The rest invites inspection, all the more so because the one clear subject in the frame, the white pagoda, is placed at the far right, so that while the eye keeps getting drawn there, it doesn't stay, but moves back to the rest of the picture. The small open shadow area nearer the centre of a road with people is a second focal point because of its position and that it contains figures, while the strip of river is noted but holds no detail of interest. These three areas total just 15%, but as there's plenty of detail suggested in the rest of the picture, a mixture of textured and deep shadow, there's room for the eye to wander and find small details like the tiny pagodas and tiered roofs. That, at any rate, is the intention. Zone 3 was the key so-called textured shadow, with what Adams and Weston and people called a sense of substance. Textured shadows have full texture, yet are distinctly dark enough to be recognized as shadows. This is a normal rendering of shadow areas, so that all the basic details can be made out. Here's one. And another. But there's choice here in exactly what exposure you give the picture and when you process a digital file. And the choice ought to depend on what you want the shadows to say. Here's a case in point. This is a hot spring spa in China, and I was shooting it as a commercial assignment. Here, I wanted to give the sense of a dark but beautiful forest at night, a bit like Avatar. I wanted the model small but definitely visible. We used a lot of artificial lighting concealed behind trees and out of frame, and by this means I could keep the model very small and yet still visible, just. Now, the feeling from this scene can vary a lot depending on how we treat the shadows, which of course is more than 90% of the image. This is one. Well, that shows everything. Or going down a stop. If a sense of mystery is important here, perhaps the first rendering is too open. In any case, there's a choice to be made. Up from that is Zone 4, average dark foliage, dark stone, landscape and building shadows. In fact, shadows can go even higher, right up to middle tones when they become open shadows. This girl, for example, is almost entirely in shadow, and we can tell that from the way the light's falling from behind and to one side and just striking her cheek. But it's a very open shadow because there's plenty of bright surfaces in front of her reflecting light back onto her. This is very typical of soft sunlight. So with all this choice, it makes sense to know what you want from any particular shadow, and so how deep you want it to appear. In fact, I count 10 different kinds of shadow, each with its own purpose and needs. First, there's a basic rich shadow, which is kind of the default. It goes almost, but not quite, to black and stretches up to about 30% brightness with good contrast. Here's a clearly separated example from a recent book I did on tea. And what I was saying about good contrast, it's high enough to show the white glove with a single tea leaf sticking to it. And that's obviously an important detail. And another example, this one shot on film, Kodachrome, which I'll come to in a few minutes. Here, the shadows occupy almost 90% of the frame, so clearly they're important to the picture. The second type of shadow I already showed you, a backdrop. It's the staple of studio shooting when you want subjects to pop out without any distraction at all, as here with a collection of Fabergé gold cigarette cases at the Louvre in Paris. Black velvet is the usual material as it's very good at soaking up light. And here it's a foreground acting as a backdrop, enclosing the subject, which is Hampton Court. In processing, it needs to be simply black. The third kind is the receding shadow. They deepen gradually to darkness away from the camera, giving a sense of depth and three-dimensionality. So it's like a basic rich shadow, but it gets darker with distance, as here. And here, where it deepens in all directions away from the candle. In return, subjects emerge from the shadows. This combination of receding and emerging can add a sense of mystery and concealment to a picture. Now, I could easily have lightened this up so that these pumpkins were a mid-tone, but as a matter of personal taste, I wanted to play on the shadows. Fourth is what I call volumetric shadow. It's the kind nearly always cast by side lighting that moves across a rounded object and really shows off its volume. The important quality here is the soft but distinct edge to the shadow, what's called the penumbra. And the key is not to have it too sharp or narrow, but neither too broad. In other words, here you wouldn't want to increase the contrast on it. In classical painting, Vermeer was a master of this. The fifth type is a little special, but it certainly merits its own way of being processed digitally. Reflective shadows are surfaces in shadow that are at an acute angle to the camera in a view that goes toward a brightly lit area. In other words, what you see are reflections of the brightness beyond. But while you can see them fully with the naked eye, the contrast is usually too high for them to appear at their best without some local processing enhancement. The appeal is an unexpected richness and density, and this is arguably the shadow type that processing can help the most. Here's an example that's been normally processed. And here, when I've given local treatment to the shadow areas. This is more like the impression I had at the time. Here's another example. First, with just normal overall processing. Next, with the shadows enhanced by lifting the white point. And another. What this kind of shadow needs is to have its range stretched, either by moving the white point up a lot or by some degree of equalization. The sixth kind is open shadow, which I showed earlier. It's the result of significant fill from a bright reflective surface, whether that's natural ambient or you add it with a reflector or fill light. Full details revealed, though at the expense of depth and volume. And it's probably the least shadow-like of all shadow types. And it comes in two flavors. One is with cross-lighting, the other with some degree of backlighting. Seventh is the smoothly graded shadow. It has a smooth transition without shadow edges from the lit parts of the scene towards darker, but not necessarily black. In other words, it's one long shadow on one surface, caused either by the edge of something distant casting a shadow, a tree in this case, or by light being diffused strongly through a translucent screen, typical of studio lighting. The important thing here is to keep the smoothness of the transition. Number 8 is chiaroscuro, which is the Italian painter's term meaning light and dark. It's actually changed its meaning over the centuries. Originally, it meant shading to show volume quite delicately, but gradually it's come to mean the stark use of hard shadows interacting with light. So it's a compositional use of shadow. And there are two flavors. One is distinct geometric shapes, the other is pattern. The shapes are the most important feature here, followed by the detail of what happens in the lit areas. Showing details within the shadows are necessary and unwanted as they would distract. And there are inevitably a few reflective shadows inside the edges of the door and window. The same thing is happening here, but it's even more abstract and therefore the geometry of bright and dark more important. This kind of shadow thrives on contrast and depth. And here's two examples of chiaroscuro as pattern. Number 9 is the cast shape. Basically, it's the shape of an object projected onto a lit surface by a point light source, like the sun. To work, it needs to be hard-edged, and it can work either on its own or paired with whatever casts it. Local high contrast is important here. Finally, there's a silhouette, which is actually the reverse view from a cast shape. It's its mirror image. The simpler and brighter the background, the more readable and effective the silhouette, so it stands out clearly. Because of the contrast and the distinctiveness of the outline, a silhouette can work when it's very small in the frame. Here are some examples. Above all, silhouettes need to be very deep, even black. And basically, the smaller they are, the blacker they need to be. And here's a variation. Multiple receding silhouettes. The backlighting and morning mist create a series of planes stretching into the distance, and each plane, looking like a cutout, acts as a brighter background for the plane in front of it. So, there are the 10 kinds of shadows. And as I've shown with some of them, to get the most out of each calls for some thought in the processing. Now at this point, I suspect some of you might be thinking, why should I bother with that? I just want to shoot it as it is and how I see it. One photographer I know, and I've shot on assignment with, David Allen Harvey, and if you haven't seen his work, I strongly urge you to look at his Instagram account, says, "I don't touch my pictures. I grew up shooting color transparency. You must get it right in the camera, so I still do." And that brings me to this. If you recognize this, you're showing your age, but Kodachrome has a reputation in photography second to none. In fact, its reputation seems to get only stronger as time goes by, and we're already many years since the last roll was processed. Like many of my friends, this was the staple film I used, and at least until Fuji's Velvia came along. And one of the reasons for its reputation was how it handled shadows. Processing was done in special complex labs, and basically once you press the shutter, that was it. Kodachrome had a lovely way with reds and yellows. Coincidentally, those were the colours of the can and the box, and these got only richer when you underexposed. So one of the things that drove many picture editors on magazines crazy was that professionals tended to underexpose, because we knew the printers could deal with that. So shadows like these, all of these shots are on Kodachrome, were rich and deep without actually going black and losing it. Kodachrome is really where the idea, the ethos of get it right in the camera came from. And of course, it sounds worthy and reasonable. It has a lot of the master craftsman ethic, and there wasn't a choice anyway. Digital changed all of that. Slowly at first, because the early cameras and sensors struggled to even mimic colour film. Now, however, all good cameras have an impressive dynamic range. They capture a lot, and that's one of the reasons why processing is much more sophisticated than it was, say, 10 years ago. The raw file has a lot more data in it than you can display in a print or on almost any screen. So choosing from it means selective processing. The second reason is simply because software engineers can. At imaging companies of all kinds, from software manufacturers to smartphone camera divisions, they're always working on new ways of doing things with pixels. Someone somewhere is dreaming up the next new clever algorithm. And here's where things get a little tricky. There are some very good algorithms out there to manipulate images. There's stuff like pixel binning, equalization, and tone mapping operators. But it's not all designed to make photographs look natural, convincing, and, well, mature. The biggest software culprits, to my mind, are tone mapping operators, or TMOs for short. In particular, local TMOs, which work by changing pixels according to their surrounding pixels. Now, you can do anything with these, but what always gets done is raising shadows and showing more detail in them. Remember when HDR came into our photography world about 20 years ago? That's when work on TMOs started in earnest. HDR itself is pretty simple. It just involves combining several different exposures into one image file that contains the entire range of brightness. The problem is what to do with it so that you can actually view it, short of buying a very expensive HDR monitor. The answer was to somehow compress the range a lot, and that's where tone mapping came in. It meant bringing down the highlights and raising the shadows while trying to keep the contrast looking normal, and on top of that, making the whole picture look realistic. I actually wrote a book on HDR photography many years ago. Well, I've written a lot of books, but I have to say I got that one wrong. I concentrated on how HDR photography could be as natural and realistic as possible, completely missing the point that a lot of people suddenly actually wanted their pictures to look unrealistic and like vivid illustrations. Here's an example of a high dynamic range scene on the Tibetan plateau, processed with some effort to keep the tones but look the way I remembered it. And here's the same shot processed in an extreme way. That book was a timely lesson for me. Images that looked in very bad taste to me were simply other people's tastes. But it hasn't lasted, and I can see much less of it these days, which suggests to me that many photographers are susceptible to being persuaded, but not permanently. So there's hope yet. There's also a steady flow of new tricks, such as in Adobe Camera Raw and in Lightroom, clarity, texture, and dehaze. One thing ties them all together, and that's an unspoken aim of making things clearer to see. Now, if you're a software engineer, it's blindingly obvious. What's not to like about opening everything up and clarifying? Well, quite a lot from a traditional photographic point of view. If you always open up the shadows, you make images flatter overall. How about this? The Pagan Plain in Myanmar at dawn. Now, here's what I could easily do with the image file, and now we can see the details of the brick temple. But why? Is that better? Not to my mind. The shot I took was heavy on atmosphere and mood. You could say, well, nobody's forcing you to use these controls, but human nature being what it is, that's exactly what's happening. So right now, there's something of a disconnect between what software engineering can do and natural, realistic photography. But there's yet another step change, and that's computational photography, and we're already in it. I know many of you dismiss phone cameras as being unserious and no match for a dedicated camera with a large sensor and glass interchangeable lenses. But the fact is that the pioneering work that's going into capture and processing is happening here. With millions of units being sold each week, these are the manufacturers with advanced and well-funded R&D departments, not the traditional manufacturers like Nikon and Canon. For instance, we've now got night mode in smartphone cameras, and it's a remarkable achievement, not least because it can produce images in the dark that reveal more than most people can see with their naked eye. It's another multi-shot technique involving some heavy lifting on computation, but some of the results, depending on the camera, look like anything but nighttime. As of now, with computational photography fusing different exposures and applying advanced algorithms, I'd say that photography is in a world of tonal and color chaos. There are no standards for how scenes should look. Each group of people involved decides for itself, whether it's a software engineering team or a gathering on an online forum. This is a new issue that has crept up on photography. An image can now be captured and or processed to look any number of ways. And that's really where the issue lies with shadows and darkness in general. Capture gets better and better. But who decides how the picture should look when it's delivered? Increasingly, processing is happening in camera. People like me, who spend time on the raw image file, are in the minority, and will be more so. In the end, of course, it comes down to personal preference and taste. So the best I can do is put my case forward. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So, I'm not sure if I'm seeing any questions that I should be seeing. I'm not seeing very much at the moment. I'm hoping that someone will repaste the questions. Okay, fine. So, anyway, I can't believe I've said everything that needs to be said on this subject. And I'm very keen to hear from any of you, all of you, what you think about this. Are shadows important? Am I right that over the years with digital processing, they're being dumbed down? That's my view, but I don't expect everyone to share it. So, oh, I see something here. Sorry. Right, I've got some questions here. Oh heavens, there's a lot, and they all just came up. Let me read out. Sorry. You see, I need my glasses now. Hannah said, fantastic presentation. Well, that's fine. Thank you very much. Which kit do you recommend for best on shadows, as some cameras tend to underexpose? Well, over and underexposure is a feature of obviously the camera. The only thing to do is become accustomed to your camera and how it works under different conditions. And it's important to choose the right metering. Basically, I choose matrix metering, and because I use an aperture priority, and because I use that a lot, I'm familiar with the kind of conditions where the camera may over or under exposure. But of course, if you're shooting raw, which you really should be, then you've got latitude to play with. Now, Derek says, Michael, you seem to have a dislike of lifting shadows, yet you accept that this is how we actually see the view with our own eyes. How? Well, yes. We see in a completely different way from the way a camera records. We see by very rapidly scanning the image with what are called saccades. So we build up an image of what the scene looks like. However, we're talking about photography. Now, the engineer's view of photography is to reveal as much as possible. But that's kind of like the robot camera attitude. And my argument is that if you pay attention to the kind of shadow that you want, many of them, or just some of them, are going to want to be deep and rich for effect. So it's not the same thing. It's not how you look at the scene, it's how you look at a photograph, which is in a very different way. Now, Dua said, who do you think ought to be the person who chooses how an image looks? You, the photographer, should be, absolutely. Julian says, when do you personally like to lighten shadows? I like to lighten shadows when they need to be open, in those situations where it's not a typical shadow in that sense of richness, but the ones I showed you. And also very much with the reflective shadows. And obviously the situations where you come across it are not usual, but that can really make a difference. But it's not so much lifting the whole thing, like doing an offset, it's stretching. It's pulling up that white point to give you contrast within that scene. William says, I always thought about photography being 100% about light. Now I'm no longer so sure. Is there a book in this? There is a book in this. It will, with any luck, be published in the second half of next year, and it'll be called Light and Shadow. Paul says, fascinating talk. Thank you. Andrew says, I use shadows a lot to help frame, hide my subjects. Yes, I mean, that indeed is one of the classic and important uses of a shadow compositionally. And now there's Vikram saying, after praising, which I will not praise myself anymore now, it says, my new motto for photo is natural, convincing, and mature. Oh, I just said that, yeah. He agrees that we are over-processing our photos. I mean, I think it's a danger. I'm glad you agree with it. Carol says, hold on, I'm typing, so I guess we'll see her lower down the list. David Thomas, a big problem these days is that composition judges often want to see everything in the image and criticize compressed blacks in the same way as blown highlights. Yeah, that is another issue. And it's a bit of a can of worms if we start talking about competition photography. I've judged some myself, and of course, that happens with a whole lot of other judges, and I agree. But I'm on a mini campaign to try and change or argue against that point of view. Then that's David Thomas. Tim Rubman. Tim, hi. How are you? Well, he just said hi. Anyway, Tim, great photographer. Black and white, and in fact I've used his pictures in a couple of my books. I'm just seeing any more questions. It's interesting what you say. There's no standard. Yeah. Jane Peters says it's interesting what you say about there's no standard to what a photo should look like. Now, absolutely, that's the core of the issue. There are no standards. There used to be chemical standards, and they might not have been the best ones. And of course, there's an awful lot you couldn't do with film. I mean, generally speaking, we sort of stopped taking pictures and went to have a martini when the sun went down. And now we can do everything. But you're right, there have to be some standards, and it's probably impossible to get everyone to sign up to them. So in the end, it's something of an individual matter. Vikram says, any thoughts on how to get started? I'm not sure. Started with what? Started with thinking about shadows. Well, I take one or two of the things I said and experiment with them. Experiment with the processing and with the exposure and see what you like. Shadows are important, says Christopher, but when you're on holiday, don't have the luxury of revisiting a different time of day. Any tips for getting the most out of the lighting conditions at the time? Yes, you just have to do your best. It's not just when you're on holiday. In many situations of photojournalism, that's it. You've got to do the best, and you can process, of course, for a kind of richness with any kind of lighting. And I've changed the way I process. And generally speaking, I leave alone the shadows. I use Photoshop, well, that ACR, Adobe Camera Raw, which is effectively what's being used in Lightroom, which more people use. But I try and avoid the tone mapping operators as much as possible. And they are highlights, shadows, clarity. They're the main ones. So I will use the highlights a little. I'll increase the contrast, and I'll try and leave the shadows alone and adjust the exposure for what I want. And then, if it's an important picture and you really want to get the most out of it, local processing. It can take time, but that's my thought. Mark Jane says, I agree very much with your thoughts. Too much emphasis on bringing out detail from shadows. Fiona asks, where would you suggest to start experimenting with photographing shadows? all around. But of course, you'll find more shadows in certain situations, particularly early and late in the day, especially if you're photographing toward the light, and those chiaroscuro ones where you, even in very harsh midday lighting, if you go partially inside or inside where there's light coming in through a window, casting hard shadows, there you'll find interesting ones. Chris George, are you going to do a book on your new shadow? Yes, at the end of next year. Next year in spring is going to be a new book called Michael Freeman on Composition, first of a series of 5. The second one later in the year will be Michael Freeman on light and shadow. Must be coming to an end of my time now. Okay, sorry, I'm being kicked off the show now because I've said too much. But the time's up. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. It's and all those questions, which of course, as a speaker, we love questions. Thank you. Bye.